Ignorance was not just bliss, but was natural and normal.
My name is Ben Charland. You're listening to What on Earth is Going On. My guest this week is Christine Overall, who's a professor emeritus of philosophy at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Now, Christine has had a long and eventful career studying things like feminist theory, applied ethics, and the philosophy of religion. But there was one book that caught my attention and inspired me to reach out to her to have this conversation. It's called Why Have Children? The Ethical Debate. Now, Christine is on the side of it's okay to have children. She has children of her own. But she's been interested in this debate for a long time because the question is not just should we have children, is it good for you personally, but is it good for the world? Is it good in a time of climate change? And of course now, is it good in the time of the coronavirus? But also, is it morally good? Is it right? Is it justifiable to have a child when you know that that child will suffer and die? It's a fascinating philosophical question and one that we dig into in this conversation. But first we talk about a few other things. Christine is really interested these days in generations and the generational divide and how these different generations, whether that's Generation X or the baby boomers or millennials, Generation Y, whatever it is, these are all pitted against each other. Why is that? Who benefits from that? We talk about the fact that philosophy is conversation and relationship, and that it's very human to wonder about truth, about ageism, not just to old people, but to young people, and about how that generational divide is perhaps an example of ageism. It's a really fascinating conversation, and I hope you take the time not just to listen to it, but to let me know what you think about it and what thoughts it brought up for you. You can go to the website at any time, whatonearthisgoingon.ca, to listen to this episode or find any other. You can also reach out to me by email or on social media. Let me know what you think of this episode or any other, and of course, let me know who you think should be on this show. Also on that website, you can find the show notes for this episode and any other. You can find the things that we talked about and references to them online, so you can do your own research and learn about this really important subject. And if you can take the time and you like this show, please give it a rating on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast app that you use. And finally, if you can, please let me know what on earth you think is going on. Okay, Christine Overall, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming on the show and for welcoming me into your beautiful home.
Oh, thank you. I'm honored to be invited.
I want to chat with you about a lot of different things. There's one subject in particular I'd like to get to, but we don't have to, which is about the whole decision of having children. I ask this because this is something that my wife and I are on the cusp of, and I think it's a personal question for me, but also for a lot of listeners, a lot of people in the world today. I'm asking this question urgently, especially because of the ethical dimension of having children in a time of climate change and the feeling that our species, or maybe our civilization, is heading towards a sort of cliff edge. So I want to get to that. I also want to acknowledge that we're talking philosophy here. For me, there's nothing more exciting than that because, as we were just saying before we started this, philosophy is conversation. And for me, this podcast is about engaging in real dialogue and learning something, and hopefully by the end of this, the two of us are changed, or our perspective is changed, and we're moved somehow. And I hope the same is also true for the people that listen.
And it's also a kind of relationship, I think. When you engage philosophically with somebody, you are relating to them in a particularly human way, I believe.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I think that to be human is to be interested in philosophical questions. So I constantly encounter people who, when they find out that I do philosophy or that I'm a philosopher, in quotation marks, they often kind of rear back and feel intimidated or shocked, or they say, oh, I took one philosophy course and I just couldn't do it. And my own view is, if they experienced that, that is a failure of the person teaching the philosophy course. Because I think that what we ought to be doing when we teach philosophy is drawing upon what I think is almost an inherent interest and ability within people, at least if they are cognitively intact, to engage in the consideration of philosophical questions. I think it's a very human thing to do. It's very human to wonder about values, to wonder about truth, to wonder about the meaning of what we are doing as human beings here on this earth. So that's why I see discussing philosophy as a very human endeavor. It's something that I think we're naturally inclined to, and that even children are inclined to, providing they haven't had it sort of repressed out of them or laughed at, because I have seen people do that with children. But children raise philosophical issues as well.
Well, even a child saying, why? But why?
Yeah.
But why? But why? That's exactly what a lot of philosophers do professionally, is just to dig what's the next level of this inquiry. And I'm really glad that you opened this box about what philosophy is, because for this podcast, I would hope that every single episode I do has a philosophical angle to it. And I think that there's no philosopher who shares what you just said who wouldn't be welcome on this program, because we're talking about basic questions, really. The question that a child would have, like, what should I do and why am I here? Basic things that philosophy addresses. Obviously, there's really complex systems of logic and philosophy that come into all this, but those are built on very simple and human foundations. And that's what has always inspired me. And I think that in terms of approachability, every time I've had a philosopher on this podcast, they were very approachable and very open to having a conversation, sometimes surprised at the notion that we were going to record just a conversation, but then realizing at the end, well, that's what it's about, isn't it? I'm not saying that philosophy should just be reduced to my questions as an amateur, but there's something about this dialogue that fits into the human puzzle, as you say.
Absolutely. And what I think characterizes philosophical discussion and philosophical thought is the normative aspect of it. So on the one hand, we can talk about what is empirical. We can talk about facts or putative facts or statements of claim about the way things are. But what philosophers are interested in is, maybe not entirely, but at least in part, is the normative aspects of human beings. So what is good? What ought we to be doing? What goals should we seek? What things are bad? What constitutes genuine truth? How do we know what reality is really like? I think these are all, at least in part, and in some cases entirely, normative questions. And I think that's what characterizes philosophy for the most part.
And hopefully why we can all approach it and engage with it.
Absolutely.
Because it's all something to do with something that I do every day.
Yes, absolutely. And so that's what I say to people who seem to be intimidated by philosophy. I say, this is about how you live your life. This is about how you make choices about the kind of person you are and the kind of person you want to be. And that's why it's great when I encounter children who are interested as well.
Yeah. Well, and I'm going to ask you, Christine, now the big question, which I think fits into that. I think it's a question a child could ask. I think it's a question that is deeply philosophical, but also somewhat pedestrian. What is going on? What on earth is going on? But the way in which I intend to ask it is the tone of it, which is the tone of the present, which feels like we need to ask, what on earth is going on in this accelerated, seemingly crazy, unpredictable era? Maybe it's no different from any other era, but it feels different. It feels like it's moving quicker and quicker. So, Christine, I ask you, what on earth is going on?
Okay, so obviously a huge question, and I was a little intimidated by it when you first told me you were going to ask me that. So I would first want to start somewhat modestly and diffidently and say I have to be very cautious about making any big claims about what's going on. But one of the things that occurs to me that is going on has something to do with the relationships between the generations. And I think that's a kind of change that has happened, and it's maybe happened within the last 30 years or so. That is, generations are being set up are being encouraged to constitute themselves and see themselves as if they are in opposition to each other. So, for example, we have the current meme of "Okay, Boomer." And we have, on the other hand, millennials, so-called millennials, being called snowflakes. We have descriptions of current parents as being snowplow parents or helicopter parents. All of this seems to be about defining generations in a way that I don't think they were talked about as distinct generations, certainly for the first half of the 20th century. So in a sense, the defining change seems to have been the arrival of the boomer generation, and certainly that generation is significant, if only because there were and are so many of us. So, of course, I'm a boomer myself. But what's interesting is that there's been an ongoing process since then of trying to define generations. So since then, we've had, it's often called Generation X, or, there was the boom generation and the bust generation. So Generation X is the generation that was much, much smaller. And then the next generation was originally called the baby boom echo. Now they're being called millennials. And then we have Gen Z. On the one hand, you might say, well, there's nothing wrong with defining these generations because they are real phenomena, at least in terms of the numbers, in terms of when they're born, in terms of kinds of influences there are on them. But on the other hand, what I find troubling is that these definitions are taking place in kind of an adversarial way, so that it's being talked about as if generations have solidarity among themselves, but are opposed to members of other generations. So I think that's in fact a kind of dangerous thing. So,
well, and there's another thing here that's happening that I think, which is that we're becoming conscious that we are a part of a generation. And I know that I guess I'm just on the cusp of being a millennial, but I'm a quite old millennial. But I think of it, well, I don't believe these things that millennials seem to believe, or do these things or whatever. I'm more part of a Generation X in these respects. But I don't think that consciousness, as you've said, is there or was there some time ago. And so I ask, when you were growing up, did you identify as a baby boomer? Or was that something that was applied later in life?
Yeah, absolutely not. I don't remember my generation being described repeatedly as a generation, as being baby boomers. I don't remember the label start actually to be used a lot to try to explain social conditions until well after I was an adult. So maybe not before the 80s. Maybe demographers were using it. I'm sure they were. But in terms of presenting it as a kind of self-ascribed way of understanding what's happening, I think that's relatively new in the last 30 or 40 years. And part of the problem is, we so often talk about things as being socially constructed. The whole notion of a generation is so clearly a social construction in certain kinds of ways. And it is artificial in the sense that, well, in several senses, but at least in the sense of, when does a generation begin? When does it end? I mean, people don't agree exactly on when the boomer generation ended. Generation X is sort of amorphous. Millennials are amorphously defined. I mean, according to some definitions, I have a Gen X son and a millennial daughter, but according to other definitions, I have two millennial children.
Right.
So the boundaries are amorphous, but more important than that is what you actually touched upon, which is that members of these generations are not homogeneous. They're not all alike. Let me just take an example from my own generation. So I'm a kind of early boomer, but I have a younger brother, 9 years younger, who is a very late boomer. And he has actually talked for several decades about the problem of being part of the trailing edge of the so-called boomer generation, because he said it sometimes looked to him as if the boomers came in, huge numbers of us, the early boomers, grabbed all the jobs, took all the opportunities, and then he was sort of bringing up the end and sort of wondering culturally what was there for him in terms of opportunities, what was there for him. His perspective is very different because he was born towards the end of the 50s. I was born at the end of the 40s. It's not a homogeneous generation, and I don't think that Gen X is homogeneous. I don't think that the millennials are homogeneous. We can certainly point to some things that they experience in common, but generalizing about them, I think, is just as dangerous as it is to generalize about gender groups or racial groups or religious groups. It just, there's a limit beyond which we ought not to be going because we're failing to see the variations within the generations. We're failing to see individual differences. But what I think is even worse about all this, is the fact that it falsely is pitting generations against each other. So I see this because I've been thinking a lot about ageism. And when I first started working on these issues, I was concerned about the kind of ageism that was directed against people of my parents' generation. But now, of course, I see ageism being directed against my own generation, and a lot of comments about baby boomers either holding on to jobs that they shouldn't be holding on to because they're depriving young people of jobs, or on the other hand, being burdened because they're not earning money, and so they're not part of the supposedly not part of not contributing to the economy. And also I see ageism going in the other direction as well, because ageism isn't just about old people or older people. It's also something that is done to young people. So I see this stuff where people generalize, especially about millennials, as being ageist, because it's assuming that a group of people have particular characteristics, mostly negative characteristics, by virtue of their age. So I see that as ageism, and I see it as wrong.
Well, in a way, this whole structure of generational defining is ageist. And it's really interesting to unpack some of the things you just said, because there are other fault lines too, such as geography. Or do I live in a city or a rural area? Or do I even live in the Western world, so to speak? Or what country do I live in? What's my economic background?
What's your race?
Sure.
What's your gender?
So many different factors that fit into this. Now, I think there are interesting things to be said. For example, there was a population boom after the Second World War in the Western world in the late 1940s and 1950s. Well, what was the effect of that? There was also a certain peace and the Pax Americana that came at the same time. Well, what were the unifying effects of that most people in the Western world could share in or understand? And as a result of that, or even the consciousness of that, what does that mean for the way that we live our lives? And what does that mean in history? What does it mean, for example, for a millennial or a late millennial to have had to be technologically native, to have had technology not just technology, but social media, the internet, a cell phone, from essentially the moment you can remember. My wife's younger brother is, I think, 11 years old. Well, he's never known of a world in which cell phones weren't everywhere. He has a cell phone at 11 years old, right? I mean, it sounds to me and to you silly, but to them, that's the way the world is.
Yeah, I have grandsons who knew how to operate an iPad by the age of 2.
Right. I remember I sat once with my sister, with her. He was only 3 years old at the time, and he could write a text on her phone and send it to somebody. He struggled a bit, but still, totally native to him in a way that it wasn't native to me. There are effects as a result of that. There are interesting things we can see that might transcend race or transcend ethnicity or gender or geography. But we're still missing the point that we can't just say, okay, well, you're born after 1984 or 1982, whatever the cutoff date is, you fit into that group. Because it simplifies humanity in a way that we can't be simple, or we can be simplified, but we shouldn't be. Or we're missing maybe the point here.
Yeah, and I think it's, I agree what you've said, but I think it's when it becomes negative, when it starts being seen as something that's bad about people, that, the claim that millennials are too sheltered, or millennials just expect to have everything, or millennials
aren't willing to work.
That's right, or live in their parents' basement or whatever. I mean, so part of what's wrong with this is a lot of these claims about members of a generation is that it fails to sufficiently notice the social conditions and the kind of difference that makes. So just speaking about my own group, the boomers, I think the assumption has been that the boomers all along had an easy ride. But in fact, there were lots of things that were challenging about being part of such a huge swelling in the population. Just the fact that the schools weren't ready for us, the high schools weren't ready for us. There weren't enough teachers, there weren't enough classrooms. That in itself played a role. And also for subsequent generations, just generalizing about them in a negative way ignores the kinds of social conditions that they're going to have to deal with. I mean, people do talk about it, I guess, a bit with millennials, because they talk about the gig economy, and they talk about the difficulties of buying a home, and the necessity of having more than one job. I talked to a young man today who works for the bank, and he told us that he also has a part-time job at a restaurant. And I thought to myself, that didn't used to be like that. If you had a job at the bank, you didn't need to also work for a restaurant. And so clearly things have changed in that respect, and not always for the better. But it doesn't follow from that preceding generations didn't struggle as well. One of the good things about being a boomer is that we were the first group in 50 years or so that didn't grow up with war. So my grandparents' generation, both grandfathers were in the trenches in the First World War. My father was in the Second World War, came home, I think, highly psychologically damaged by that. So one good thing for boomers was that we didn't have to go through war, at least not in Canada. I mean, obviously in the States they had to deal with the Vietnam War, and since then we've got international military events all over the world. But
well, they seem to fit into a different category than the First and Second World Wars, which were total, all-encompassing conflicts.
Yeah, absolutely.
That brought all the resources of all of these nations into play.
That's right.
Against one another, and changed the paradigm, right? I remember my grandmother, who I guess would be considered part of the quote-unquote greatest generation, the ones who fought in the war.
That's such an odd name, by the way. Americans made that up.
Right.
I mean, it's just, yeah.
Yeah, was it Tom Brokaw, I think, who made it more of a famous phrase. One of those guys, one of those quintessential American journalists. And I was asking her, she was born the same year as the Queen of England. And Queen Elizabeth II,
yes.
she's not just the Queen of England. And I asked her about her, I mean, maybe this will take us in a different direction, but what her thoughts of the future were. This was a few years ago. And she was telling me how she was not very hopeful for the future. Now, she spends all of her time watching CNN or just the news, and she's not very hopeful about what's happening and where we seem to be going. And I said to her, well, come on. I mean, you were 15, 16 years old when the Second World War started. I mean, this was a cataclysmic conflict that, if at least at the time you thought was threatening your country. You might be ruled by Germans one day who have a very different philosophy from you. And she said, no, that was different. At that time, we believed in something and we knew that we were going to win. And even if we lost, we were behind it. Now, there's no belief in anything. Now, I know I'm taking us in a different direction.
But that is very interesting. Coincidentally, my own mother was born in 1926, which I believe is the year Queen Elizabeth was born.
So same age as my grandmother.
Yes. So that's my mother. And my mother is still alive. She's 93 and a half. And I asked her about 2 years ago what her view of the present and the future is. And she was very optimistic. And I said, Mom, how can you be so optimistic? And she said, well, I guess it's because I came through a depression and the Second World War. And things look a lot better to me compared to those times.
That's what I thought my grandmother would say.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, it could come down to individual personality,
Sure.
or it could come down to simply perception in the broadest sense. That is, what are you looking at? What are you focusing on? And for my mother, it's the contrast between how bad it was in the past. You know, her own father survived the trenches, just barely. In fact, recently, just a kind of footnote on that, the First World War military records for Canadians were opened up for general perusal. And my daughter-in-law actually found the military records for both my grandfathers. We were able to actually read through them. And what was shocking for me was how much time they spent hospitalized, because they were both injured. They were both ill. And I realize now that both my grandfathers barely survived. So 2 generations ago, there were men that barely got through. My paternal grandfather apparently was listed as weighing only 113 pounds when he enlisted,
Wow.
if you can imagine. He was barely more than a child.
Jeez.
So from that point of view, things look a lot better. My great-uncle lied about his age, enlisted at 16, went off immediately to France and had his foot blown off, and that was the end of his war. So I can see why, from my mother's point of view, having been raised on stories about coming through the First World War, having experienced the Depression. I mean, she's talked about the poverty she saw around her during the Depression, and then going through the Second World War. I guess that's why times look better to her. So it's very interesting that your grandmother sees the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, and to go back to this idea that we are shaped by these huge events, which may not be as huge as we think they are at the time, but an event that is huge today would be the presidency of Donald Trump, for example. Now, I don't need to bring Trump into the conversation, but I'm using this as a way to say that in the end, that may be a pretty small event in history. In the end, maybe not. It certainly seems like it's a big deal today, and this will have reverberations. His presidency, the fact that he was elected, will have reverberations for a long, long time. But it may be 100 years from now, we look at it as a funny footnote in the chronicles of the early 21st century. But we think of it as a big deal right now. Therefore, it is a big deal right now. And someone 100 years from now better recognize that we can't stop thinking about this. Whether you're for Trump or against Trump or neutral to it or just interested in it, this is a defining feature of our moment. And I think that whether it's our generations or just the people living today, growing up today, are affected by this. And their worldview is changed by such events, or just by the presence of this conversation that we seem to be having.
Well, and it's the fact that, and there's nothing new about this point, there's the fact that news is ubiquitous. You can't get away from it. You can't avoid knowing everything that's happening. I go to the gym to work out. You know, there's a huge bank of TVs.
And you can't turn them off.
That's right. And you're just exposed to it, and it's just running past you all the time. I think that people probably now, for good or ill, have much more of an awareness of what's actually happening. Sometimes, of course, that awareness is skewed by manipulations of the news, but it may be that we're just immersed in it so much more than in the past. Although everybody, for their own time, has a sense that this is the most important time ever.
Yeah,
we're all
chronocentric, as they call it, right? That we privilege our own time over others.
Absolutely.
But what seems to be interesting about our time is that it is more ubiquitous and more extreme than ever before, because not only can't I escape it, but the device on which I'm looking at it, whether it's my phone or my iPad or just a TV in the gym, is so powerful compared to how powerful it used to be.
Yep.
Whether it's radio or television, these devices are constant but also very powerful in the algorithms that they're programmed with. One tactic to make your phone less addictive is to turn it to black and white.
Yep.
Because the colors are so vibrant that they train your brain to go look at it again and again and again and again. And the news, this consumption of the news, it doesn't mean our moment is more privileged, But I think that there's no moment in history I can think of where we were so exposed so regularly and so intensely to the political situation and to bad news, especially, because bad news, if it bleeds, it leads, as they say.
Well, and we know so much more than we did in the past. So air quality, I'm sure, was terrible in the 19th century. I'm sure water was dangerous in most locations. People didn't know as much about that. Science was not nearly as advanced as it is now. Now we have much more knowledge about what is actually happening to the planet, what's happening to the environment around us. We can't escape from knowing how dangerous things are, whereas perhaps in the past, ignorance was not just bliss, but was natural and normal.
Well, and this is an interesting philosophical question that I've often encountered, which is the choice, if it is often a choice, between ignorance and knowledge. What we're talking about now seems to be that it's not a choice, that we are exposed to this stream of the news, and that as long as we understand the language it's presented in, we're going to be imbibed with it. But there is a certain sense that I can choose what to look at. I may be seeing it in the gym, and I can't help it, in the same way that I see an advertisement on a billboard. But what am I going to go look at when I go to my phone? Am I going to look at cat videos, or am I going to read the Washington Post? And the choice between knowledge and ignorance is interesting because it doesn't necessarily have an effect either way. I may still be the same person or have the same consequences in my life, whether I choose knowledge or ignorance. And I wanted to raise this because I find it an interesting inquiry that's been tackled both by philosophers and artists, who, like, Samuel Beckett, for example, the Irish playwright of the 20th century, who tackled this question of, well, is it a good idea to know? Is it a good idea to try to know? Even Sophocles of ancient Greece.
So as you're speaking, I'm reminded of a wonderful article from the 19th century by a man named William Clifford. Have you heard of him?
No.
He talked about the ethics of belief. And he, I think, may have been one of the first to explicitly say that our ethical obligations apply not only to what we do, but to what we actually believe. And he went so far as to say something like, this isn't an exact quotation, but it's close. It is everywhere and always wrong to believe anything on insufficient evidence. So in other words, we have an obligation, he suggested, to only give our belief to those things for which we have enough evidence. And otherwise, our obligation, and he meant this in a moral sense, our obligation is to withhold belief. So I want to suggest here, not only, as you've said, do we have some choice about what we expose ourselves to, but we also, I'm inclined to agree with Clifford here, at least in part, we also have a choice about what we allow ourselves to accept. So we have a kind of moral obligation, which I think is not very much honored or recognized, to search out evidence and to be careful with our assessment of evidence in such a way that we don't allow ourselves to take on inappropriate, unjustified beliefs. And it actually sets a very high standard, but I have a lot of sympathy for it. It has the interesting effect of probably rendering a lot of religious belief unethical.
Sure.
Because what a lot of religious people would say is that they don't believe on the basis of evidence. They believe because of something like faith.
Or revelation.
That's right. Yeah. So they take that leap. Well, okay. I mean, revelation of a certain kind might even constitute evidence. I would not rule out that possibility. I don't think it's very likely, but I wouldn't rule it out. Just one little side note here. Years and years and years ago, when I was doing my PhD thesis, I actually did it on the philosophy of mysticism. So I was very interested in the evidential value of so-called mystical experiences and what, if anything, they might suggest about the nature of reality.
Fascinating.
Yeah. So we can apply, apply careful evidential standards to any form of experience and ask whether that kind of experience is actually giving us a reason to adopt a particular belief.
Something that came up in this conversation so far that I found really interesting is what is the problem with ageism or dividing us by generations? It seems like a harmless thing to do, but in fact, it does the same thing that racism does or sexism does. It divides us, and it fails to sufficiently note the social conditions that lead to those divisions and that lead to us living the lives that we do. We're blinded instead by an easy cutting and slicing of our society when we can actually ask what is really going on. Now, coming up in this conversation, one thing that I find really interesting is when Christine talks about how she first got involved and interested in the subject of reproductive ethics in philosophy, which of course led to the question, should you have children? That's all coming up on this episode of What on Earth is Going On. I find this really, really not only interesting but good, because I think that there's too much in our world today that is forcing us to take a position whether we know or not. I mean, going back to Trump, are you for or against Trump is one thing. Do you believe climate change is happening or not? A or B, black and white. Are you a Democrat or Republican? Are you liberal, conservative? Are you against or for gay rights, for example? Really simple questions that force a black and white answer. And often we go, well, of course I'm for gay rights. Of course I'm anti-Trump or whatever it's going to be. And often if you pick one, you can predict how you're going to pick the other ones more and more. But it's interesting, if you don't have sufficient evidence, it's okay, therefore, to say, I don't know.
Yes. Which
is funny because it's not I don't know out of ignorance. It's I don't know out of, well, maybe it is ignorance. It's a sort of Socratic, I know enough not to know. I just don't know. And that's why I'm going to ask questions. But that's not cool. That's not acceptable to say today, to say I don't know, to these very basic ethical and moral dilemmas, which to say I don't know is almost seen as ethically problematic, in the same way that George W. Bush would say, you're either with us or against us. You have to pick one or the other, and it's not justified to be in the middle or on the fence or not sure yet.
And it might very well be that you have to say, I don't know, when you are aware of conflicting evidence. So it might be in some cases that you just don't have enough evidence, or it might be in some cases that you have a lot of evidence, but the evidence conflicts. And I think this happens when people are having to make difficult medical decisions. So for healthcare professionals, when they're dealing with illnesses that are new or conditions they haven't encountered before, they might very well have to deal with conflicting evidence or conflicting information about the effectiveness of different treatments. In cases like that, you have evidence, but you don't have evidence that sufficiently predominates on one side. So the appropriate thing to do is to suspend belief. The appropriate thing to do is to say, here are the different possibilities. We may not be in a position yet to make a decision or to make a choice. Of course, with healthcare, sometimes you just have to make a choice, and you have to make it even in the absence of insufficient evidence to dominate. But for me, that was one of the most important things I learned from my own philosophical training, was the importance of always seeking out the evidence. Going back again to teaching philosophy, I would sometimes find students coming in who thought, they would say, well, philosophy is just whatever you think. There's no right or wrong. It's just whatever you think. And I would say, Well, yes, we are interested in what you think, but we want to know what the evidence is for what you think. We don't just want to hear your opinions, but we want to hear the grounds for those opinions. And I think that the kind of cultural moment that we're in right now, there's a tremendous amount of exchange of opinions. There's maybe not enough time spent probing the evidence for those opinions and comparing or assessing the ways in which the evidence might point in different directions. And when it does, what choices do you then make, both about action but also about belief?
Well, and this is what's interesting is because there, as you say, there is this huge preponderance of opinion and essaying and saying I believe this because of this and beating my chest, but not necessarily showing what the evidence is. But there's also the cherry picking of the facts. I mean, the climate change debate is very interesting because those on they call themselves now climate realists, although it used to just simply be climate change deniers. They're saying that there is evidence, and here are the few papers that we can point to. It is true that of the 100, if you say, I can't remember the actual number, but 100% of all the scientific papers, there are some that doubt the science. There are some, I don't think any of them say bluntly it's not happening. Some of them say, well, we're not sure. We're not sure of the degree. We're not sure of the extent. And these are reasonable scientists that are doing what scientists do, which is be doubtful, be dubious. I don't know about this, so I'm going to ask the questions. That's what science does. And the short-circuiting that's happening in science today, using that doubt against science, the scientific method for me is composed of doubt. You doubt what the other person is saying, and you see if you can find another hypothesis. That's fascinating and has built a lot of what we have around us. But when it's thrown against science for those who don't know how it works, it becomes a big problem. But the other thing I would say is that when we're talking about facts and cherry picking the facts, that your values can lead to what facts that you choose.
Yes.
Because if you look at the internet, there's facts to support everything. I mean, I'm sure there's some study somewhere for an anti-vaxxer that they could say, oh, look at this little footnote in here that says to me that I should not have my children vaccinated.
Well, or there are putative facts. I mean, not all of them are necessarily facts.
Sure.
Obviously, a lot of it depends upon interpretation, and as soon as you're engaged in interpretation, you're probably bringing in values of some sort.
Well, and the other question I had for you when you brought up Clifford, this idea of insufficient or sufficient evidence. Well, how do we know when it is sufficient? How do we know when the evidence is sufficient or sufficiently non-contradictory?
Yeah, absolutely. There's no formula. There's no general method for that. I think what it does is, and I think what Clifford's original intention was to make people more cautious, to make people more modest about claiming that they knew things. So if you take seriously the notion that there is an ethics of belief, that we do have obligations to be careful about what we give assent to, then you're probably going to be more careful about making general claims or putting forward ideas that don't have much evidence. There isn't a formula for saying when do you have enough evidence. Although, I mean, obviously, consulting people who have done research in an area is a pretty good way to begin.
Well, and that is the crux of another issue, which is the sort of anti-science.
Oh, anti-intellectualism.
Anti-intellectualism.
Oh, my goodness. Yeah, that's something that is really puzzling to me because it seems to me that this has become more and more predominant at precisely a time in Western culture when more and more people have had more and more education. So we have a higher percentage of people who've gone to university than ever before. We have a higher percentages of people completing high school. And yet that hasn't translated necessarily into the kind of respect for science that one would expect from people who have perhaps had firsthand exposure to it through their education. So it's baffling to me. But this is related to one thing I wanted to mention earlier, that as a feminist, very early on when I was first when I was first becoming a feminist and getting to know about feminist ideas and being part of the feminist movement, one of the questions that a lot of feminists said you should always ask is, who benefits from an oppressive situation?
Cui
It's
bono.
important, yes.
Or is it cui bono or bene?
No,
Always mix it-
bono.
bono, okay.
Who's good? Yeah. Yeah, that's more Latin. I'm probably the last generation that studied Latin, I guess. I hated it at the time, but it turned out to be useful. Yes, it's important to ask who is benefiting from the current situation. Who benefits from inequalities? Who benefits from failure to believe in scientific evidence? And I've got to say, it's got to have something to do with, at least in part, big corporations. I've got to assume that certain corporations benefit from people's ignorance. Certain corporations benefit from inequality. And perhaps in some cases, governments also benefit as well. So it isn't just about individuals coming up with these ideas and running with them. These are things that suit the socioeconomic context and presumably contribute to the well-being of the 0.1% of billionaires, or whatever the percentage is.
Yeah, I mean, I find that such an interesting question, and I don't always, but I often forget to ask it. Cui bono, who benefits? Not just from a feminist perspective, but from just a general, when we're encountering a problem, who's benefiting from this situation? And just because we spent so much time talking about generations and the dividing of generations, if we were to look at that conversation and look at this idea that we're pitting these generations not only amongst themselves but against each other, who benefits from that paradigm? Can we? I don't know the answer to this. I don't know if you've thought of this before, but who benefits from that?
So one thought I have is that when you have these generational divides, just like any kind of divide, sexual identity divides, religious divides, racial divides, and so on. Those divides get in the way of cross-boundary solidarity. They get in the way of our seeing what we have in common. And I think that they tend to undermine people's motivation and ability and willingness to try to make changes. So if you see yourself as part of some smaller self-defined group, you're only going to be wanting to look out for the well-being of your group. You're not going to see the kinds of things you have in common with other people in other groups. And that holds the present situation. I think that helps to preserve the status quo. So I think it's a fundamentally sort of anti-change kind of a move. You know, it's always been sort of common knowledge that you divide and conquer. So generational divides, I think, are just a new form of divide and conquer. How do you keep people down? You prevent them from seeing that their humanity is the same as the humanity of people in other groups. That's
fascinating, and it rings true on so many levels. One of them that I'm thinking of is in the First World War. That war was happening at the same time as the Russian Revolution, 1917, and a rising sense of workers' rights and a rising sense that the lower working classes of Europe and North America had more in common with each other than they did with their national or nationhood. So that when the guys fighting in the trenches on the German side on one and the French or American or British or whatever on the other, if they ever realized that they were kind of the same, fighting each other, and the true enemy of them, the true ones who were holding them back and down, were the guys leading them from behind, the generals and the elites, the middle and the upper classes, well, that was a situation that can't happen. And the high command when the famous football game occurred across the trenches in Christmas. I think it was Christmas of 14
Eve or something.
1914, when the guys on both sides got up and played a soccer game. That was awful, because what happens if they discover that they shouldn't kill each other? What
Yeah.
happens if, moreover, they discover that they have more in common with one another than they do with us who are leading them?
Yep.
And you can almost imagine, not that this happened, you can almost imagine the Germans and the British getting together and saying, let's not do this. Let's keep fighting. But let's not have that happen, because otherwise we'll all lose our heads. We'll all lose our jobs. Look what's happening in Russia. What would happen in Russia 3 years later? And I think that this mentality of divide and conquer, to prevent us from seeing what we share with one another, to prevent you and I from seeing what we share with one another,
Yep.
because we happen to be of different generations,
Yep.
I think is a very interesting way to look at it, especially if we ask the question, who benefits?
Yep. And the odd thing, so here's the thing that I think is particularly odd about the generational divide. And that's the fact that we all have family and friends from other generations. So it makes it particularly bizarre that we're being set up to see each other as enemies. I mean, I must say, I do worry that it's trying to set people up for coming very, very hard times when, I mean, we're kind of at a stage in human existence right now where, at least superficially, a lot of people are doing really well, and they're doing a lot better than people were a century ago. But I think things may very well get much, much worse. So when things get much, much worse, it's going to be a matter of who's going to be sacrificed, and it's going to be easier maybe if people are encouraged to see themselves as having nothing in common with other generations. So it's easier to sacrifice them, just as it was easier during the First and Second World War to see young working class, primarily men, though some women, as cannon fodder. They could be sacrificed.
What is the coming crisis? Is it climate change? Is it economic inequality? Is it a scarcity of resources? I mean, what are we looking towards in the future when you say that?
Okay, well, here's where I have to be, I have to be really cautious.
Sure.
And I think appropriately modest. This is just my own view. This doesn't come from any particular expertise, but I just think that it's obvious that we can't go on pillaging the planet the way we have been, and this is another thing that is astounding to me in lots of ways. I feel as if there's a much more widely accepted view about the dangers of the direction we're going in, but there is not a concomitant willingness to make sacrifices. So, for example, when you look back, again, I feel very conscious of what things must have been like in the First and Second World War, even though obviously I wasn't alive in either one of those, but I had two generations telling me about what it was like, and during the Depression. And the impression I got was that there was a certain degree of collective willingness to mobilize and even make sacrifices to deal with the conditions at the time. So just the idea of, collecting bits of metal and having victory gardens and being very careful what you cooked and all of those things, saving things. The generation that came through the Depression just was completely committed to saving and preserving and reusing. They were in conditions that were emergencies, and for better or for worse, they mobilized. Now, but now it's as if we sort of say we are in a climate emergency, and I think that is true, but we're not willing to mobilize. So I don't know what is coming, but I have a tremendous fear, because I feel so connected to succeeding generations. I'm still very connected to many of my former students. Many of my former students have children whom I know, admire. I have my own children and my own grandchildren, and I just think things are going to be bad for those generations, and I don't feel as if we're doing anything to prepare for that. So why are we still flying everywhere? Why are we still driving? I am willing to give those things up. And in fact, I feel as if I should give those things up because I've already had a chance to do a lot of wonderful things in my life. But I don't see other people being willing to do that.
Well, isn't this the prisoner's dilemma? I mean, isn't this exactly what we're talking about? That why would you give these things up if no one else is going to, or if an insufficient number of other people are going to do it to make any difference? And this is the same argument that many governments around the world make, including including Canada under Stephen Harper, which was essentially, why should Canada do anything when China and the United States aren't going to do anything? We might as well continue polluting because we make such little difference on the large scale. It's the tragedy of the commons. It's the prisoner's dilemma. And it segues actually beautifully into a question I wasn't sure I was going to get a chance to ask, which is, in the context of this, it looks like it may be impossible, partly because climate change is such an intangible reality. The Second World War and the Depression was something that everyone could see happen in front of their eyes, and they knew that having a victory garden or buying victory bonds or doing their part was critical, because otherwise they really could lose everything, and they could see it happening in the newspaper. They could see it happening across the street. They heard about people dying across the world, and they had relatives who were going to fight. It was real for them in the way that climate change is barely real for us. I mean, we're not even sure if hurricanes are more powerful, and some island nation is complaining about rising oceans. Most people don't give a damn. And I think that the intangibility makes it hard, but we know it's a problem. We know it's an emergency. And therefore, I, as a potential future father, say, is it the ethical, moral, responsible thing to do to bring a child into a world which may be getting worse, in which my child may have a lesser life or lesser or fewer opportunities than I did? And is that justifiable?
Okay, so before we move right into that question, I just want to say something about what you talked about leading up to it, and that is that I think I've thought of it as a kind of cognitive dissonance. There's a kind of cognitive dissonance between the fact that on the one hand, we're surrounded by conditions that would have been unthinkable luxury, even as recently as, let's say, 75 years ago, even 50 years ago. We're surrounded by that, and yet at the same time, we're told, and many of us believe, there is an actual emergency. So there's the dissonance between here's the environment, but here's the emergency. And just as you said, in the past, I think there wasn't that kind of dissonance, because people knew about the fatalities in the war. People could see, my mother could see that children in her class during the Depression were barely adequately clothed and probably hungry. We don't have that immediate exposure to the nature of the emergency now. So the question about whether or not it's justified to have children, I want to say two things in general about that question. First of all, it seems like a new question in some ways, and at least when I first started thinking about this issue and trying to raise it, I think a lot of people had trouble even seeing it as an ethical issue. Like having children. Of course you can have children. It's just a personal choice. It's a choice about what you're going to do with your life. It's not an ethical question. But of course it is an ethical question. So on the one hand, recognizing the nature of the question is something that maybe is somewhat new for people. On the other hand, interestingly, when I started thinking about this question, which for me was many decades ago, I discussed it with my own mother, and she told me that she herself, having come through a depression in her lifetime and the Second World War, she was not actually, she did not see military action, but she married a veteran and she knew what the war had been like. She asked herself whether or not she should have children. Now, in the end, she did, but it was interesting to me to hear that. And I have talked to people who, during the nuclear weapons buildup in the 60s and, the Cuban Missile Crisis and all the things that were happening, then there were certainly people wondering whether or not they should have children. So on some level, I suspect that there may have been people for many years who have asked themselves this kind of ethical question. The difference now for us, of course, is that we have so much more control over our procreative behavior. And women in particular did not have much of that in the past. There weren't very many ways to control how many children you had. It's really fortunate that now we have that choice. There are philosophers who have argued that we ought to have no more than one child, ever. There are philosophers like David Benatar, South African philosopher, who have argued and continue to argue that the only ethical choice is to have no children. Although, interestingly, Benatar's argument is not so much based upon the current world conditions, but rather just based on a very general argument that if you create a child, you create a being who's going to suffer. If you don't create a child, then you have not created a subjective center of suffering.
Yeah, I in research for this episode, I read a bit about David Benatar and your response to David Benatar, the fact that you actually met him in South Africa and got a chance to debate with him on some of these.
He's a fascinating guy, and I will tell you, I mean, he is such an interesting man. I have so much respect for his thinking. He actually ended up contributing to a subsequent book of mine because I did an edited book on the ethical relationships between people and companion animals, and he is also very much interested in animal well-being and animal suffering. So he ended up contributing to that book too. So he's a fascinating guy, and I in retrospect, I sometimes think that I may have been a little too sanguine in trying to refute his arguments. I mean, the one argument that I think I would definitely stand by is that he does somehow seem to claim to know that every life is so bad that it would have been better if that person had never existed. And I think that's a huge claim to make about every single human being. The title of his book is Better Never to Have Been. And he takes that view about every single human being. And that in itself seems kind of presumptuous that he would say so. And he also says it not only of human beings, but of every sentient entity, every entity that is capable of suffering. For every single entity, it would have been better if they had never existed. That seems to me to be our gargantuan claim. On the other hand, on the other side, it's absolutely indisputable that if you create a child, you create somebody who not just might suffer, but will suffer. To be human is to be, and will die. Although the question of the value of death is a different kind of question as well. I mean, it obviously makes a difference as to when you die.
Sure, but I mean, it's hard to imagine as a parent giving life to new creatures knowing that they will cease to exist one day.
Yes.
That's a difficult thought.
Yeah.
It doesn't change the rubric, I guess, that we're dealing with. But I found it, in reading about this, I found it really, really interesting. In some ways difficult to refute, even just the pure math of it, that to give life to something is good and bad, but to not give life is good because of the absence of suffering and not bad, and therefore one seems to outweigh the other.
Yes.
If you on this very basic mathematical schema.
Yep.
But you could also say that that the good and the not bad. Well, the not bad. Anyways, we could get into it quite deeply, and we don't have that much time left. But I just wanted to ask, why did you tackle this subject early in your career? This idea of giving life. I mean, it's such an interesting question, but as you said, it's not something that we really encountered for a long time. Why is that a question for us now? Even if we put climate change and the impending cliff to the side, why is this something we're grappling with today?
I don't know if I have a kind of socioeconomic or cultural answer to that.
Yeah.
I do know for me, I mean, I can say just in autobiographical terms, I can say that when I had my first pregnancy and my first child was born, I started to realize that there was a huge range of issues related to human procreation, and I thought that they were philosophical issues. And I still remember going into the Philosopher's Index, which is an index that documents almost every publication in philosophy in English, and also manages to include a lot in French, German, Spanish, I think sometimes Russian as well. So it's a huge source, and it goes back, it was initiated in the 40s. So it's not complete. It's not documenting everything that came before that, but it's a pretty huge source. And I remember going in there and looking for what other philosophers had written about the ethics of procreation and not finding anything. This was in the late 70s, other than people were just starting to write about abortion.
Right.
But they were not writing about issues related to childbirth. They weren't writing about issues related to what were then called the new reproductive technologies. They were not writing about new reproductive practices such as so-called surrogate motherhood. And I was astounded because all I could see as a new mother was that there was this huge panoply of issues that were crying out for being dealt with. And so I started out dealing with primarily things like in vitro fertilization and the freezing of eggs and hiring women to gestate babies, because those seem to have a particular cultural urgency. But underlying it all for me was the main question: why have children? What are children for? Why do we have them? I still remember years ago when I was a teenager, and the mother of a friend of mine said, "Having children, that's what we're here for. That's the purpose of life." And as a teenager, I was very disturbed by that thought, because all I could think of was, okay, if my purpose is to have children, and then my children's purpose is to have children, and so on indefinitely, what's the point?
It's turtles all the way down.
What's the point? That's right. That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Yes. What is the point of the indefinitely large row of turtles? There must be something that gives it meaning, and if there isn't, why are we continuing it?
Well, I mean, any kid, I think, could hear that and go, "But wait a minute," and have that simple reaction of, then their purposes that just doesn't compute without some kind of psychological jujitsu to justify my own existence, I guess. But it's such an interesting quandary.
So on the one hand, it does not compute. On the other hand, we have to acknowledge and recognize that people derive a huge sense of meaning and value from having children, and that people's relationship with their children, or their relationship with their own parents, their relationship with their grandchildren, is a huge source of joy and as they say, gives them a reason to get up in the morning.
Right.
So
I think I've heard someone say that having children is not the meaning of life, but if you don't have children, your life has no meaning. Which
yes, so I don't think that's true, but I understand why people would say it. I mean,
Sure.
One thing I say is deciding to have children is a decision to change your life forever. forever. Right. I don't think there's anything else you can do that will change your life more.
Well, and there's one other thing I wanted to say, which was when you were starting to research this stuff, there's something that was concomitant with that, which is socioeconomic, the fact that more and more people were choosing to have fewer and fewer children as a result of increasing education more than anything. Prosperity, but as well as education may be the most determining factor of deciding either not to have kids or to have fewer kids. So that's something we could unpack. And unfortunately, we just don't have any time left. But it's such an interesting question to leave us on. Why is it that when people are more exposed to, I guess, thinking or rational thought, that they would choose not or to choose to do less of this procreation?
Well, at the same time, I would say the more people have fewer children, the more valuable those individual children end up seeming. So people put much more into child rearing now than they ever used to. When I was a kid, parents never played with their kids. It was go outside, come home when the streetlights come on. No parent would ever say that today. They spend all day with their children when they're home. So the fewer children there are, the more the children seem valuable, I think.
Well, and doesn't that take us full circle to the generational debate or the generational issue that millennials are often seen as spoiled or snowplowed for them because there's fewer and fewer of them per family, more and more attention for each one.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
And therefore they may respond to the world as if it's all theirs.
Yeah, well, that's true. And I think it's a good thing. I mean, I think the changes in child rearing have mostly been good. But why have people chosen to have fewer children? I think it's because people have in part come to realize that there are many possible ways of creating meaning in their lives, and it doesn't necessarily rely only on having children. And the reason they see that there are many ways of creating meaning in their lives is that they have had more education, so they see that there are more possibilities for themselves.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful place to leave us on, if only because I've met so many people in that position, and there is no sense in my mind that someone with kids has some special passport that they don't have, some special meaning that they don't have.
Right.
There's many ways to go about it, and that's in part why we can look at David Benatar's argument and not be flummoxed by it, not be offended by it, but accept it as something to think about, something to consider.
Absolutely, yes. And I think that's the value of philosophy, getting back to the beginning, was to provide those kinds of provocations, to stimulate us to think further about things that we might otherwise take for granted.
Yeah, what do they say? That wisdom is the ability to entertain a thought without accepting it, without necessarily accepting it. Mm-hmm. Christine, thank you so much for taking the time. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Oh, thank you so much. It was lots of fun.
Great.
Really appreciate it.
To learn more about Christine Overall, go to the website whatonearthisgoingon.ca. There you can find all other episodes and the show notes for this episode. In other words, those are the reference points, the things that we discussed and that you might want to learn more about. That's whatonearthisgoingon.ca. And if you can give this show a rating on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast app that you use, it's very much appreciated and helps spread the word about what we're trying to do with this podcast. Now, your quote of the week is from William Clifford, and it's something that Christine actually mentioned in this conversation. It goes, "It is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence." Thanks as always to our composer Andrea Wetstein for providing this wonderful music, and Thanks as always to our composer Andrea Wetstein for providing this music, and special thanks for this episode to Christine Overall for allowing us to record this episode. Thanks as always to our composer Andrea Wetstein for recording. Thanks as always to Andrea Wetstein for providing this wonderful music. Thanks as always to our composer Andrea Wetstein for providing this music, and special thanks to Christine Overall for allowing us to record this episode in her own home in Kingston, Ontario. Next up on this podcast, we're going to talk about writing with Ottawa author Elizabeth Hay. She wrote the book Late Nights on Air, including many others, and it's a really fascinating conversation. I'll see you then.